Alrighty, so the first case study that we're going to dive into is for US voters in 2012. Now, a quick data set summary. This is 2012 population and voter registration data from the US Census Bureau, broken down by state and by age group. So you can see this screenshot of the data set here on the right side of the slide. And what I've done here is actually format the column headers to indicate what we're working with in terms of dimensions or measures. So again, dimensions are your categorical fields, measures are your numerical or quantitative fields. So the n equals 255 just indicates that we're looking at 255 records or rows of data in this case, so pretty small data set to kick things off. As far as dimensions are concerned, we've got state and age in columns A and B, and then for measures we've got total population, citizen population, registered voters, and confirmed voters. And the concepts that we'll cover in this particular case study are calculated fields and value settings, specifically percent of column and percent of parent. So with that, let's jump to Excel and dive in. Alright, so go ahead and open up the pivot table case studies file and jump into the first tab, the US Voters 2012 tab. And from here we can Control A to select all of our data. And I'm going to insert a new pivot table on a new worksheet. And before we dive in, let's just name that sheet Voter Pivot. And I actually want to highlight this tab, just a light shade of green. That way, as we continue to work through the case studies in this workbook, it'll become clear which tabs are raw data and which ones are pivots. So now, as an analyst, given the data that we have on hand, some of the questions that I'd like to explore here are things like, how does voter turnout compare across states? Are certain age ranges more or less likely to vote in general? And do these trends hold true nationwide, or are there state-specific insights that we can uncover here? So, as you know, these are all questions that pivot tables do an excellent job answering. So let's just see what we can come up with. Now, right off the bat, let's cut our data by state as rows and pull in some of the metrics that we care about. For now, let's use citizen population, since only citizens can vote, and confirmed voters, and start there. Now I'll go ahead and format both of those as numbers with 1,000 separator and no decimal points. There we go. And finally, I'll sort my states descending by the citizen population. So, as expected, we see big states like California, Texas, Florida, and New York at the top of our list. And then down at the bottom, obviously, our less densely populated states like the Dakotas and Alaska, Vermont, and Wyoming. So, no surprises there. From here, I want to add a calculated field because what I'm interested in looking at isn't just the number of citizens and the number of confirmed voters, which is interesting but not entirely surprising. What I want to do is actually calculate a ratio so that I can see out of the citizen population what percentage of those actually became confirmed voters. So let's go into Tools, add a new calculated field. I'm going to name this Voter Population Percentage. And again, that's just going to equal the ratio of confirmed voters to the citizen population. Press OK. We'll format this as a percentage with 1 decimal point. So we can already see a completely new story start to emerge here. And we're not only seeing a state-by-state comparison in terms of the total number of voters, but also as a ratio of the eligible populations. So why don't we go ahead and sort by our new metric, voter population percentage, to get a sense of where we see the largest share of voters. So definitely some interesting trends here. We see District of Columbia, or DC, at the top of the list with a voter population percentage of 76.1%. That makes sense. You know, it's the nation's capital. It's the political heart of the country. But then you also have states like Mississippi and Wisconsin, which may come as a surprise to some. Now, scrolling down on the other end of the spectrum, we see West Virginia, Hawaii, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Now, this isn't necessarily the time or place to dig much deeper into why these trends are the way they are, so what actually causes the West Virginia population to be less likely to convert into voters compared to Massachusetts or Colorado, for instance. But what might be a really interesting next step would be to pull in some additional data from the US Census that you might be able to tie in here. So maybe things like income per capita or education level or additional demographics might help to provide some additional context and give you tools to better understand the why, or the driving forces behind these voter rates that we're seeing here. But one additional piece of information that we do have on hand is age. So let's go ahead and grab age out of our field list and add it to our view as secondary row labels. And now as we look through this view, we can see some additional trends start to emerge. So for example, in our top states, we tend to see really, really strong voter population rates among older populations, especially the 65 plus age bucket. And then generally the younger age buckets tend to show smaller rates, but still relatively strong. So 62% in DC within the 18 to 24-year-old range, just under 64% 18 to 24 in Mississippi. And then scrolling all the way down to the opposite end of the spectrum, one thing that's kind of interesting to see is that you still get relatively strong voter rates out of the older populations, not quite as strong as the top states, but still in the 50s and 60s. But when you start looking at the younger age demographics, the 18 to 24s, the 25s to 34s, you see much, much lower rates down here in states like West Virginia, Hawaii, and Oklahoma. So for instance, of those aged 18 to 24 in West Virginia, there are 162,000 citizens that fell into this age bucket, and only 37,000 became confirmed voters, which is a rate of 22.8%. Similar case in Hawaii, 26.4, 27.2 in Oklahoma, even lower in Arkansas. So still pretty directional at this point, but a really interesting insight nonetheless. Now, the next thing that I'd like to explore a bit more here to kick things off is the composition of the voter population. And to do that, I want to use some of our show values as calculations. So why don't we start with just age group to begin with, pull state out into the filters so that I'm just looking at my data organized by these 5 age group buckets. Now from here, if we're interested in looking at the distribution of the voter population specifically, let's just pull in a second instance of confirmed voters right here in column D. And now instead of just showing these with no calculation, let's show them as a percent of the column total. Now what this tells me is that among all confirmed voters in this data set, so in the year 2012, I know that the largest share of those voters fall into the 45 to 64 range, followed by the 65 plus range at 22%. And on the other end, you've got your smallest proportion or share of voters, which fall into 18 to 24. So the youngest voters make up only 8.54% of the total number of confirmed voters nationwide. Now let's drag state back in as our primary row labels and see how these trends look at a more granular level. So in this case now, rather than formatting them as a percentage of the column as a whole, which is kind of tough to read since the percentages get really, really small here, I'm going to change that calculation to percent of parent and set state as my parent. And now we have an entirely new set of insights at our fingertips. So we can drill in state by state and see how these proportions by age ranges differ from place to place. So DC, for instance, is kind of an interesting story, which is that the largest share of confirmed voters within DC actually come from the 25 to 34 bucket, whereas most other states like Mississippi, Wisconsin, Minnesota show the largest share of voters coming from the 45 to 64 bucket. So for whatever reason, the voter population skews a little bit younger in DC than it does in many of these other states. And then scrolling down, another interesting insight to see here is that for these low voter population states like Oklahoma, Hawaii, and West Virginia, look how small these proportions are, particularly for the youngest age group, 18 to 24. So less than 5% of voters in Hawaii fell into the 18 to 24 bucket, and only 6% in Oklahoma fell into that range. So for whatever reason, the younger populations in these states really don't seem too inclined to get out there and vote. So definitely another interesting story, and really just starting to scratch the surface into some of the interesting angles that we can take with this data set. So that's our kickoff for the US voter case study. Go ahead and give the homework exercises in the next lecture a shot and see what else you can discover.